All right, so this class and the next couple of classes, we're going to go specifically into our high wire crops a little more in depth than we touched on in the fall. So let's dig right in. Um, you're looking at a picture of a pepper crop that's probably about, maybe 2 months in of growing at a commercial facility. So not all the way, up to its full height, but working its way up. And that would be probably close. We're a little ahead of where most commercial growers are right about now, this time of year. They would have planted in November and they'd be growing on up, and their first fruits would be starting to set. Um, as far as pepper plants go, they are tropical, right? So they enjoy warm conditions and a decent amount of light. Uh, Obviously, humidity is something with all crops. They can certainly tolerate a certain amount, but we have to keep an eye on it. Unlike, say, cucumbers, when we talk about them in a couple of days, a couple of weeks, you'll see that they really enjoy humidity. But they also are still prone to powdery mildew, so you have to get a lot of disease resistance built into them. Another interesting thing about peppers is their fruit, as you'll see as we go through this lesson, is sensitive to light. So all these leaves that are hanging down help shade the fruit and keep it from sunburn. So it's definitely not something you would strip all the leaves off at the bottom, maybe like you do with a little bit with tomatoes, kind of. But just your standard growing information. Obviously, none of this is really carved in stone because ECs we fluctuate according to the weather conditions. But we definitely need to make sure we have enough feed going in, right? So if you have weak plants, right, that means you're chronically low on your ECs and the plants just aren't getting enough nutrients. Now you're going to see other symptoms when it comes to that, but maybe before symptoms happen, if you have a good eye, you might see that the plants are starting to weaken. So you definitely want to keep your ECs fairly high, 2.5 to 3.5. We were running our ECs around 2.5 in the fall. So we're starting to get into longer days, a little more growth potential. So we're going to run the ECs up a little bit more as we go. But if we're too high in our ECs, right, then we end up with short, compact plants, small leaves, and they don't get that sun protection that we're hoping for. So you want the leaves to be a decent size. So we got to make sure you don't overfeed in that context. As always, we water early in the day and we stop early in the day. So now the phrase uh, transpiration before irrigation applies to all of these high wire crops, which means you don't irrigate before the sun comes up and the plants start transpiring. So, you're going to time your computer irrigation to sunrise and then stopping anywhere from, 3 to 4:30 in the afternoon would be your last irrigation, and then they go through the night and then start again. So, how much EC is enough? Someone might have thought that with the last slide. It depends on light. So usually our computer systems will float the EC based on how many watts of global radiance we're getting, or if they have a power sensor, they might actually go by moles. Um, uh, Temperature plays a role. If you're running warmer temperatures, then you're going to float the EC. Um, Now, depending on how that works, this is not as simple as up or down. If you remember from last week's lesson and from the fall, that when you get into high vapor pressure deficit situations, so in the summer, say it's warm and dry, right? We know that there's a lot of transpiration happening in the plant, and so we want to minimize our salt buildup in the leaves. So we're going to go lower ECs in hot, dry, high VPD situations, um, which, this relates to water demand, temperature, relative humidity, all these factors play a role. And then there's also the age of the plant and the fruit load. So um, obviously more fruit means it needs more fertilizer, right? So that's mostly referring to early establishment, which we're getting into now. So When we're looking at EC assessments, just relating to what I just said in the last slide, where basically transpiration rates, which is affected by VPD, have a big impact on some nutrients and not others. This is maybe the first time we've talked about this. It's an important fact. We got to keep this in the front of our minds. Potassium, sodium, calcium, magnesium. These are what we call passive nutrients, right? So that means that the plant has no control over how much goes into the root, right? That is very critical when you think about it. Compared to nitrate, chloride, sulfate, phosphate, these are actively absorbed by the root, so they expend energy transporting them across the membrane. Whereas with the positively charged nutrients, it's passive. So as long as they're, there's water flowing through the roots, they can flow into the plant. So if you're in a situation where there's high water demand, so very high VPD, you may oversupply these nutrients, these types of nutrients to the plant. And that can start accumulating as salt in the plant itself and in the fruit and create imbalances. So typically in high VPD, we lower the EC, right, to reduce this high salt risk, which will start to impact growth and create smaller cells and also the risk of fruit splitting, for example. So age of fruit and fruit load are also factors when it comes to EC. This is primarily for the early establishing phase when we've just planted out on the blocks and we're trying to get the plant to establish itself before we let it have fruit. So that's where we may withhold some feed, lower ECs again, to encourage root growth and foliar expansion so that the plant's a little more vegetative to get established. It depends on your climate and what your strategy would be for that. But all right, so remember that nutrients that are positively charged for the most part are passively absorbed. So they are what we call transpiration limited. So you've got to make sure you have enough transpiration happening. That's where this VPD is so critical. Having a suitable VPD for your crop to be nutrient balanced. This is peppers very early on. This would have been like early December growth. Now, we did talk about this last fall a little bit, but I'll remind you, and I've got a nice picture to show you. We talked about removing what's called the king flower, sometimes called the crown flowers. And then the next two are often removed, and then we leave a couple of flowers, and then we have a pause with some more removal, and then we leave every flower after these. So from the fourth note up, we keep all the flowers. That's sort of your rough flower fruit load maintenance schedule. The single plant is allowed to grow two branches so that we have two stems from each vine. So we let one sucker continue, and then we maintain those two only and remove other suckers to keep it just at two. So as far as removing lateral stems, right, we leave two. We remove all flowers that appear below the fork. So you don't often see ones below here, but on some varieties you do. But you definitely, the king flower you'll see, and these first two. So these are all removed. Whoops, my eraser doesn't always click on. And if you're removing side shoots, you can snap them or use a clean knife to cut them smoothly off. It's kind of like trimming a tree, I suppose. If you use a knife, it will heal over a little better. I haven't been very particular about that in the past, but knives are definitely very useful for keeping a clean cut. And continuing in the growing front, a daily average temperature of about 20-21 degrees is required in order for flowers to set. Right? So why is it important to remove the king flower and the first fruit? We've talked about this before, right? We're trying to keep the crop on track And if we are too generative in the early stage, the plant kind of weakens. We want to make sure that it's in a vegetative phase to begin with to establish itself. Also, that's the fruit set puts a sugar sink load on the plant, which of course then diverts nutrients away from roots and leaves as we sort of establish the plant. Same thing, same vein of thought. So then, of course, if you get flowers aborting, it means that you have insufficient energy, right? We did talk about that in last term. We saw a bunch of flowers drop off the peppers because we were heading into December and there's very little light. So normally peppers are not carrying as much fruit load as we had through December, but we do have grow lights. But you will find that not many growers use grow lights for peppers because it's just not economically viable. Yeah, I think we know the answer to that. Okay. I had also talked a little bit about this in the fall when I introduced it, this idea that with, say, smaller peppers like hot peppers or banana peppers, you can leave small lateral branches periodically and you'll get a second set of fruits coming off. And that way you can increase productivity for smaller peppers. Smaller peppers have a less of a sugar sink load on the plant compared to bell peppers. So you can obviously get away with having some more lateral branches and more fruit forming. So again, summarize the first part here. We want to have strong roots, so we're going to remove fruit load initially. You want to see good large flowers, good coloration, and we don't want to see flower abortion. We want to see a good balance between vegetative and generative growth shortly after the second node from the fork. And then from there on, it's all about maintaining that perfect balance to reduce stress. And of course, in peppers, stress typically plays out as flower abortion. And every flower that's aborted can cost the company a lot of money because if the entire farm drops some flowers, now you've got some fruit loss. But good news, like our variety at the college, flowers often come in clusters. So you can remove excess flowers at those clusters and leave your one strongest flower in that cluster. So again, 18 to 20 degrees Celsius promotes flowers and fruit set. If you go lower, it increases the generative growth. If you go higher, it increases vegetative growth. So temperature is probably one of the biggest indicators for you to balance your pepper crop. So if you're getting too high a fruit load or flower set, then you're going to run higher temperatures and get a little more vegetative growth. And these are our target VPDs for sort of a happy balance. And the relative humidity, well, that falls because it sort of plays into this. Once you've got your temperature and your VPD set, then that all falls in line. Pre-night dip, you should know what that is now. That usually starts fairly soon, actually, up to a week after transplanting. So small plants. And the pre-night starts around 4:30. So you say you do your last irrigation, and then you start dropping the temperature down to about 16, 17 degrees Celsius. And you do that for 2 to 3 hours. And then you start to float the temperature back up to your daytime 19s or so, a little low for the rest of the night. And then at daytime, boom, back up into your temperature for productivity. Remember, the previous numbers were daily average temperatures. So we're talking averaging night and day. So that's how you end up with a DAT of like 20, 21, because you're averaging your highs for your day and your lows at night. So there you have it. So your daytime temperature and your nighttime for setting generative growth. So now someone may have thought of this, your different seasons have different challenges. And summertime is very difficult to control your nighttime temperature. There's nights where 16, 18 is just not feasible. So you have to use irrigation and other strategies to maintain vegetative or generative growth in your peppers so they don't become overly vegetative. But typically the high daytime temperatures in the summer will also contribute to some stress and drive the plant to a more generative stage. But that's something that is variety specific. But generally speaking, nighttime temperatures for your generative growth. As far as environmental problems for peppers, there's a bunch. Sun damages fruits. What you're looking at here is sunlight damaging peppers. This actually looks almost like a fungal infection, but it probably started as a solar burn. So typically we need to whitewash the greenhouse to keep radiation under control so that we don't, sunburn our peppers, or we can use shade curtains. But whitewash has to come off by the end of August so that you have enough light going into the fall to maintain your fruit load. It's just a picture of a helicopter whitewashing greenhouses. This is St. David's in near Niagara Falls, Niagara on the Lake, I guess. Now, so far no one's made this mistake, but typically when coloring is about 80% is when it's ready to harvest. And harvesting, you could snap them off like I did, but technically a clean knife cut is the best. I try to avoid the knives and have them floating around everywhere. But nasty cuts or breaks are an opening for disease, right? So, and then of course, just like with Wayne talking about trimming trees, a flush cut will heal the best and reduce disease. From harvesting peppers, it's important to know that they should not be stored with other fruit, right? So keep them away from tomatoes. They are very ethylene sensitive, so they'll start to rot very quickly. Now, they don't store them quite as cold as some produce. They like it around 7 degrees Celsius. So, moving on to insect pests, there's your standard pests for peppers. A lot of farms have aphid banks. These are oat grass. I'm assuming you've learned this, but I'm going to talk about it. These are actually oat seedlings. So you put a bunch of oat seeds in a basket, and they start growing on oat grass, and then you inoculate these with what's called a cherry oat aphid. And the oat aphids only attack monocots. So obviously, being peppers, tomatoes, cucumbers, they're not monocots. So the aphids don't migrate into the crop, but they happily grow and feed on the oat seedlings. And so then what you do is you inoculate these hanging baskets with Colamani, typically, or Aphidius abdominalis, and they will predate on the cherry oat aphids and then propagate and then fly off into the crop to control aphids that might otherwise attack your crop, like green peach aphid or oleander aphid or whatever, melon aphids. So these banker plants are very, very useful, and a lot of farms do employ banker plant, in their production facility. So they have a section where they grow them, because these things expire. They're only good for a couple of months, and then you got to replace it. So it's nice to have a steady supply of fresh banker plants to hang up in the different zones. Looking at all the other bugs, there's ligus, cyclamen, cabbage looper, European borer, thrips, pepper weevil. I'm going to go through them. So this is looking at a pepper. Aphids actually leave feeding marks. These white sort of cloudy spots are from aphids feeding when the fruit was young. So obviously, I think at this, you would probably, so you're looking at a ligus bug on the left here. And that's at, I think, the third instar, and this is a final adult. They will feed on the peppers and cause deformation. What's really helpful, I think, is a lot of times young growers confuse ligus with aphids. So looking at the second, third, and even the fourth instars, they are aphid-like. You can see if you're not looking carefully, you might think, oh, it's a green peach aphid. Where in fact, the differences are that we're missing the cornicles, right? So ligus do not have that. Plus, if you notice, the antennae are back on an aphid, whereas they're forward on a ligus bug. So be sure to make that distinction because the ligas can cause some pretty severe damage to your peppers. So you need to properly diagnose them early to control them with the correct chemicals and biologicals. These cornicles are for releasing pressure. I don't know if you've learned. I think Graham probably talked to you about this. I'll just mention it. You know, when any kind of insect feeds on a plant, there's a certain amount of pressure in the sap, and that pressure shoots into their mouth, and it can actually cause their abdomens to swell. So with aphids, what they do is they bleed off excess sap pressure from these cornicles. So oftentimes you see droplets forming on the cornicles, especially when the plant has really high root pressure. And that's to make sure that they don't burst their little tummies on the sap. And often you'll see ants licking away those droplets, or what we call mining. Their ants will in fact pick up aphids and place them in parts of the vine to better mine the sap. It's an interesting sort of, I don't know if it's symbiotic, but it's certainly mutually beneficial, I guess. Be a little scary to be picked up by an ant and told to poke your thing into a phloem and just stay there and be good. Anyways, this is what happens to peppers when they've been fed on by a tarnished plant bug at a young stage. So when you've got your your flowers been pollinated, you got a young fruit forming. At this stage, if the liga starts feeding, it will cause major deformations in the fruit. So you definitely want to keep an eye on this. Cabbage looper, these are little green caterpillars. They can be very big, very small. This is quite large. Looks excessively large to me, but whatever. They're little green caterpillars. You can see feeding in the leaves, but they will also burrow into the fruit, and that's not good. Typically, you'll see masses of eggs laid out in this kind of an array, and that's your first clue that you have cabbage loopers. The little guys are very hard to see. Sometimes you'll see the mummy underside the leaf like this. It's just sort of a loose webbing, so you can see through it to where the pupa is. And they do form a moth stage. In the ornamental world, I've seen some veggie growers do it. We often have moth traps at night. So they're on a timer with a UV lamp, and it's basically a bug zapper. And that will attract moths and kill them. And you can actually, really disrupt a lot of the population with something as simple as a bug zapper. Then there's exotic cabbage worms, Asian ones that get very big, and they have sort of white moth stages. All very similar, same method of control with, a bug zapper. Then there's the European corn borer, which is in North America, and it's a devastating one. They burrow a hole, go inside, and hollow it out. And you'll see it's sort of open on the side of this pepper. If you squeeze that pepper, it would just sort of collapse into mush. European corn borer is a huge problem. Obviously, for corn, you would just see a little hole in the corn cob, and when you peel it off, it's all eaten away inside. BT is organic certified spray, Bacillus thuringiens spray that you can apply if you're battling European corn borer. There are genetically engineered vegetables available, but because of consumer demand, they're not used, and they produce BT in the tissues, so they have no corn borer problems. A lot of the corn that's grown commercially is BT engineered to be resistant to corn borer. Unfortunately, what that means is that like sweet corn, which is what we buy to eat, is typically not GE. It's sprayed with all kinds of stuff to keep European corn borer under control. They could spray BT, but it's quite expensive. In the ornamental and veggie world, there's higher margins, so we can get away with using something a little more expensive. But growing field corn, it's just too expensive, so they use other chemicals, which are not as friendly. So, yeah, that sucks. Cyclamen mite. These little buggers, they're hard to see with the naked eye, even with a loupe. Typically need a microscope. But if you see this kind of dry, cracked, scalding skin, even in a pepper, all gnarly, and the top is where they spend a lot of their time. The tissue is all woody and corky. You have cyclamen mites. So hypoaspis, not too bad for controlling that. Again, there's some soft chemicals that can be sprayed to deal with that. But cyclamen mites are not as common a problem. But we have seen more because we're not spraying much. We're using a lot of bio. So cyclamen mites are sort of getting a bit of a resurgence in both the ornamental and vegetable world. So it's something to be aware of. Because typically our hypoaspis is in the soil zone. But anyways, cyclamen mite. And just out of curiosity, whitefly, which is, a common pest and fairly easy to control with, yellow sticky traps. It is probably one of the more common pests in tomato and peppers and eggplants. Not so much cucumbers, but a lot of research has shown in the last couple of years that mites like to hang on to parts of whitefly to move around. So they're like the bus system, public transit for mites. They hitch a ride on the whitefly, then they jump off on another leaf. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that there's enough brain capacity up here to figure this out. It boggles my mind. Anyways, this is a link if you want to read about that. That's on their PowerPoint, obviously not the video. Thrips scar. They've got a really serrated ovipositor, and so they scratch and hack away at the surface when they lay eggs, and you get these kind of scratchy regions near where they've laid eggs. So yeah, annoying. Pepper weevil. This is one I want to spend a little more time on because the other bugs, I mean, you should have learned this stuff with Graham. So if not, talk to me in class. But now pepper weevil is unique to peppers. I think it attacks eggplant as well. But typically what happens is the female can lay up to or more than 300 eggs over a span of a few days, and they take 3 to 4 days to hatch. And within 1 to 4 hours of hatching, they begin to feed. And if they're in the flowers, they feed on pollen, which causes deformed fruit because they're not sufficiently pollinated. Also deformed fruit because they're feeding on the ovary, affecting its structure. And sometimes they move to the young fruit. If the flower's already been, say, pollinated, they'll move into the maturing fruit. They migrate to the center and they feed on the seeds that are forming inside the fruit. So they're devastating. They are just devastating. There's just a little white larva, very small. It's hard to see. This kind of gives you a context. This is a regular sized pepper split open. So this is probably about 3-4 millimeters long. And you get browning, you get decaying tissues in the center. You can see there's sort of necrosis happening. These are the exit holes from the mature beetle or weevil as it's exiting. Here's one coming out. This is what the mature weevil looks like. Then they'll either male or female go and do whatever they got to do to reproduce and make even more eggs. These guys have been a huge problem for the pepper industry. 2 years ago, we couldn't tour pepper houses in Leamington because they were so terrified that we were going to bring pepper weevil from other greenhouses into their greenhouse. So it's a big deal. They have relatively good control strategies. They've figured a lot out now. So, those farms are a little more open. And a lot of it has to do with pheromone traps. So there's, these would be male pheromone traps or female, depending on what your supplier is, that are attached to big yellow sticky cards. And so then the flying stage ends up landing here and getting stuck. And you break the cycle of laying eggs, which, every one you catch is 300 eggs less. So they put a lot of these traps out and try to keep it under control. I've seen 4x8 yellow sticky planks outside the greenhouses on angled walls with pheromones all over them, trying to catch weevils before they even get in the greenhouse. Another thing I've seen greenhouses doing is they wrap yellow sticky tape bands around the entire greenhouse. So let's say this is your commercial greenhouse, right? Gables. Wow, just horrible. They'll just run a yellow band around the exterior of the whole greenhouse. Because what they found was that the weevils walk along the grass. They don't like to fly as they're feeding, or if they fly short distances and then they land again. And they come to the greenhouse, then they start to crawl up the wall, and they have to crawl over this yellow tape to get into the greenhouse through the vents. So they catch them on these yellow stripes. I think that really rough drawing conveyed the information, right? Anyways, so pheromone traps, having staff remove any fruit that has a hole in it, boom, get rid of it. But ideally, eggs. Now, this is really hard to see, but see how there's a dimple in this pepper? That is where an egg is developing. Now, you got to have a keen eye to be able to pull that off. I don't know if it's possible, but if you can catch them then, fantastic. The other thing is clean. Like a lot of veggie farms are pretty clean. Any dropped fruit is picked up and discarded right away. When they're emptying the greenhouse between crops, they do not compost it on site. They take it to landfill and have it buried so it composts there. Not necessarily a bad thing, so that there's some organic material in there. Other thing to keep in mind is that pepper weevils overwinter on nightshade vines, which is a common weed in southern Ontario. So keep any presence of nightshade vines under control around your farm or neighboring properties. And as far as biological control, there's still a lot of research going on. It's mostly pheromones. There are some naturally occurring predators for outdoor pepper growers. Mostly in Florida and Mexico. I don't know. There's probably some in Ontario, but most farmers resort to spraying pyrethrin. Now, pyrethrin is organic certified. It's derived from chrysanthemums, but it has a problem, and that is that it is toxic to aquatic life. So it's absolutely critical you spray the right amount and you don't have any runoff into a river or stream, or you will kill frog tadpoles and stuff like that. So yeah. Okay, diseases. Go through this list. Fusarium, pepper mild mottle virus, tomato spotted wilt virus, powdery mildew, impatient necrotic spot virus. Bunch of stuff. So Fusarium stem rot is, you say here you can see there's a nice green turgid stem. Then it goes brown. This would actually be squishy and soft. And it will just destroy a vine. Here you can see it's beginning at a joint where the fruit is attached to the pedicel is attached to the stem. So it's at this point you need to spray fungicide to control it. But once it's inside the vasculature, it's very difficult to control. Typically you would cull the plant and remove the bag so that it doesn't produce spores that get into your irrigation water and spread through your whole farm. So it's important that you're scouting your crop regularly to identify these kinds of hot spots. And keep an eye on your staff, because any trimming or snipping they're doing with a knife can spread this disease. So they have to be educated to be able to see these things themselves. You can't be everywhere. And if they're working and they see Fusarium, they know that they're going to have to dispose of the plant and sterilize their knife, or drop it off for sterilizing and pick up a clean one. If you look inside the stem, there's a brown central pith. That way you know there's Fusarium in the plant. It starts to choke off the vasculature, especially in the summer when plants are most susceptible to it, and then they can't get enough water up the plant and the whole plant succumbs to water stress. Pepper mottled virus. Pretty straightforward. It looks like a pocked face. That's actually a plant virus. And the same thing happens here. You need to rogue the plant out and discard it so it doesn't spread. Any piercing, sucking insects will spread this virus to neighboring plants. So you want to be on your game if you see this, or it will destroy your entire crop. Tomato spotted wilt virus. This is what it looks like in the fruit. You sort of have successive rings. Remember last term we talked a little bit about this. And you'll also see rings forming on the leaves at central points where the virus was first introduced. So if you had an aphid that fed right here, boom, the virus starts to reproduce. You get rings coming from that spot. And from here and here, you can actually kind of see the feeding pattern. Powdery mildew. We all know what it looks like. Sometimes it's easier if you're looking up through the leaf from below. If you see lighter shades in the leaves, that tells you that there's powdery mildew growing on the plant. So then you can stop and have a quick look to see what's going on. Now, we're not selling leaves, so it's not like you're going to rip the plant out, but you're going to probably look at your climate to make sure it's suitable, and you probably have to do a fungicide application to keep it from spreading. Impatiens necrotic spot virus, this is a real tough one because it looks a lot like, a potassium deficiency. Now, the difference here is potassium deficiency would appear along the edge of the leaf first, necrotic, and sort of moving inwards, where the spot virus starts anywhere, in the middle of the leaf lamina or on the edge. So it's important to make that distinction. So if you think you have a deficiency, but it's not presenting, then you know it's probably a virus. The other thing to remember is that if you have potassium coming in or not coming in, it's going to affect the leaf uniformly for the most part. So you're going to see necrosis on both sides of the leaf uniformly. If it's only on one side, it is unusual. It can happen where maybe part of this vasculature is affected and affecting one half of the leaf. But generally speaking, it would be a symmetrical presentation if it was a deficiency. Bacterial leaf spot. This is fairly common. You get dry cankered spots on the fruit, almost like an aphid had been feeding on it. But if you scout and you see no aphids, then you look in the leaves and you start seeing sort of soft, wet-looking regions in the underside and also on the top. You most likely have what's called bacterial leaf spot. Bacterial leaf spot usually happens when there's water on the leaves. Now, typically in a greenhouse that shouldn't happen, so you need to look to make sure there's no dripping happening. So sometimes if you have a spot in your greenhouse where there's a constant dripping, say there's a leaking pipe or a window that never closes and it always leaks when it rains, or you have a point where condensation accumulates and drips all the time, you may actually want to have no plants in that location, or pay special attention to that location to make sure that you don't get bacterial leaf spot. Now, a lot of farms, because it is fairly common, they spray regularly with bacterial phage. So these are viruses that are designed to infect the bacteria that cause these diseases. There's a company that sells it called Agrophage. You put it in your sprayer tank. The robots run up and down the aisles and spray the vines. They typically do these for a number of bacteria. Like we're going to talk about canker coming up soon. These phages help control any kind of bacterial infection by infecting them and causing the bacteria to sort of split open and release more virus that will infect more bacteria until there's no bacteria to feed on, and then the virus just disappears. These are safe. They do not infect humans. There's zero risk. Basically just using Mother Nature's approach. The other option is you spray a copper solution of some sort, like copper sulfate, and that will kill both bacterial and fungal diseases. So if you're trying to kill two things at once, that's another option. But you can't harvest right away. So then there's the Homo sapien. I'm just kidding. Yeah. The only welcome predator, right? Physiological disorders. Elephant's foot. This is, I have pictures coming up. That's when you've got a little too much fertilizer at the juvenile stage. It causes the stem to get too large and it sort of splits open. It's also something I've seen in cannabis for some of you who are in those crops. Blossom end rot, we've spent lots of time talking about this. Don't need to continue. Sun scald. All right, so that's the sunburn we talked about. Fruit cracking and pointy tip. This is irregular irrigation and growing too cold. And then, of course, silvering. So let's look at some of these. This is elephant's foot. It's kind of gnarly, spread out of the bottom as opposed to going straight into the soil. It looks more like an elephant's foot. Typically, the problem with these is that these sort of wide parts create openings for fungal infection or canker to get in, and that will choke off the vasculature, and the plant ends up with restricted water and nutrient flow, and it becomes weaker and weaker. So it's something we definitely need to avoid. So reduce water, it reduces water transport, yeah, especially in the summer. All right, let's move on. Blossom end rot. This is what it looks like in pepper. We've talked about this before. BER. It starts at the bottom of the blossom, the tip, and just the necrosis works its way back. So we got to make sure we have enough transpiration and we're supplying enough calcium, right? That's the key. So if you have a couple of days, especially at the early fruit, say the flower is already pollinated and it's just starting to form a fruit knob, if you have a period of time where there's lots of relative humidity, let's say you get 5 overcast days with lots of rain in the summer, that's a potentially high humidity situation. That's where you have to be working extra hard to supply enough calcium to make sure that that ovary doesn't malform. So you got to watch those critical times of the year. It could also be in the winter if you're not venting enough, and it's, we just went through a few weeks of hardly any sunshine. Brutal time to make sure there's enough calcium getting into the plants. So you're going to oversupply some calcium in the media, and you're going to put your heating pipes on, try to get movement of air through the crop to drive that calcium. Because remember, calcium needs transpiration to move. So low temperature and light affects pollination, which then you get these weird looking fruits, deformed, odd looking things. So typically cold temperatures affect how pollen forms or clumps or doesn't even shed evenly. So parts of the anthers will shed pollen, others don't, and you end up with a very non-uniform fertilization happening. So that is for sure manageable as a grower. You should be able to manage that. Sometimes you also see internal growth, and you may see very few seeds because there's poor pollination. If you've ever seen this growth inside a pepper, again, that's at the point of fertilization where those deformities happened. So yeah. Cracks, longitudinal cracks in the fruit. This is where you have rapid expansion of fruit, right? So if you have irregular irrigation, so let's say your bags dry down excessively, and you come in, you're like, oh no, and you give them the full shot of water, water will rush into the fruits because they're concentrated full of sugar because it's been dry. So the nutrients and sugars are extremely high. Water rushes in, causes the cells to expand, and the fruit can't grow with the expansion, and this tougher exterior skin doesn't stretch, so it cracks. This is a pretty extreme case. Sometimes all you see is sort of woody longitudinal marks like this. We've had a few in our peppers in December. Another thing is rapid growth causes silvering. So this picture here, there's a little bit here and some in this pepper, but this pepper is displaying it pretty badly. Essentially what happens is if you have rapid, like really rapid growth, water and nutrients, let's say, okay, they're not enough to cause it to split, but what happens is the tissue separates because the external epidermis on the outside of the peppers pretty tough. I think you've all had pepper skin stuck in your teeth at some point. It's pretty tough, and it doesn't stretch nearly as well. And so if the tissue underneath is starting to expand and is not expanding at the same speed as the epidermis, it kind of shears off, and you get like a pocket of, not almost like a pocket of air underneath that epidermal layer, which makes it look silvery. So again, this is where managing your EC and transpiration is critical, so that the water flowing through the plant is flowing at a consistent, predictable rate. You don't have rapid and slow times a day. The name of the game is even. Just like having that big greenhouse volume gives us a more stable environment, we reduce those fluctuations, we improve our yields, and reduce our losses. Here's some sun scald pictures. So if you see necrotic tissue, but there's no sort of sign of fungal infection, like I don't see a ring of radiating hyphae or whatnot, you can suspect that it's sunlight, and someone's removed too many leaves and the sun is actually hitting the fruit directly. So again, unlike tomatoes, here keeping the fruit in the dark is helpful for them to color up and not sunburn. Because remember, this green on the skin is chlorophyll, and the fruit doesn't have the ability to deal with all those extra negative charged electrons flying off the sun that's hitting them. So it creates photooxidative damage. All right, so nutrient problems, typically these are very slow things to fix. You got to really be on top of that game. We want to be on, sending away water analyses regularly to make sure that the nutrients are right on track. Don't get so stressed about what the leaves look like, because we're growing fruit, not leaves. But you definitely want to be on your nutrient game regularly. And looking at some specific nutrients, I'll start with manganese. Manganese is more often in a state of toxicity than deficiency, but it is immobile. So you'll see purpling on the leaves and yellow necrotic. I didn't have great pictures that I could find. Again, because I don't think it's really that common in peppers. Boron, aside from your normal misshapen fruit, which can be difficult to diagnose because we know that, for example, ligus causes it. We know that improper climate causes it with poor pollination. There's boron also impacts apical meristem, so that would also potentially impact fruit shape and development. But a telltale sign is with leaves, you get sort of these odd demarcations of color, and that is indicative of boron in peppers. So just a little heads up for boron with that. But again, I haven't seen much in the way of nutrient deficiencies in vegetable crops, because nutrients are managed so strictly in those places that it's pretty rare. Iron deficiency in peppers, this is a really extreme situation, but we already know from last term, what's the first thing we check? pH. And you got to think, if you're in a large farm that's spent millions of dollars, they're going to have automatic control for pH. But, part of your regular grower quality control is checking the nutrient solutions to make sure the sensors are not out of whack. So, I'm bringing this slide up because just to remind you, right? Remember, we have mobile and we have immobile nutrients. But what's interesting about this slide from the Dutch nutrient masters is that the nutrient toxicity presents in old leaves as opposed to new leaves for immobile nutrients like iron, manganese, zinc, boron, right? See how that works? You can see that the deficiency presents in the new leaves and toxicity presents in the old leaves. Now, deficiencies present differently in the new leaves between them all. some variation of intervenal chlorosis and necrosis, if you remember that from the fall. But toxicity typically is just spotty necrosis throughout the leaves. Usually before it gets to necrosis, it looks kind of like purpley spots everywhere. And then eventually the tissues start to die and you get necrotic spots. But it's interesting that there's this flip between new and old leaves for deficiency versus toxicity. So something to keep in mind. I think that pretty much wraps us up for peppers. So there's a quiz on peppers this week, as there is every week for tomatoes and cucumbers as well. So hopefully you stay on top of that. All right, I'll see you on campus. Bye.